Thank you for being here. My name is Chris Wardlow. I'm a prevention specialist with Catalpa Health in the Fox Cities, and I'm contracted to Outagamie County to coordinate the county's substance use prevention efforts. I also have the honor of being on the prevention committee of the State Council of Alcohol and Other Drug Abuse, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this issue, this topic that we're going to present on today. But before I do that, I want to turn it over to Cindy, my colleague in prevention, and have her introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Cindy Zarnik-Niemeyer. I'm a therapist and prevention specialist with Catalpa Health, contracted to the Appleton School District. Alcohol, tobacco, other drug abuse, mental health, whatever they ask me to do, I do. I also have 4 children, 4 adult children, and I am a foster parent. We've been foster parents for about 14 years. To kind of start us off, my grandfather on my mother's side died of alcoholism when my mom was about 18. My grandma went on to remarry an alcoholic who also died of alcoholism. So my mom learned some things in that family growing up that for her kind of helped her keep her head above water. She learned things like you can't always trust that people will do what they say they'll do. She tells a story of she and her brother, my uncle, she was in about 5th grade. My uncle was in 3rd grade. They lived in Chicago. They were very poor. Her parents were separated, my grandparents at the time, because of my grandfather's drinking. My grandpa, her dad, called her on the phone and said, be waiting on the corner of 6th and Lincoln tomorrow at noon, and I'll pick you up and take you to the circus. Well, they were very excited because they'd never been to a circus, and they also really missed their dad. So that next day, my mom dragged my uncle out. She was in about 5th grade. He was in about 3rd, about 11:30, and it was 11:30, and it was 11:45. And it was 11:50, and it was noon, and it was 1, and it was 2, and it was 3, and my grandma finally pulled them in at 4 o'clock because my grandpa, her dad, never showed up. So she learned things like you can't always trust that people will do what they say they'll do. And for her in her life, that's what helped her keep her head above water in raising 10 children, myself being the 2nd oldest. She also learned, and research shows this, that if you have a plan B, things tend to go better. In families where there's a severe stressor like chemical abuse and dependency, hopefully there's a non-using parent who has a plan B, things tend to go better. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about resiliency and protective factors. Our children, we have 4 children, and they won the jackpot. So on my side, they have alcoholism and depression. My grandfather, I never met him, but I think he really struggled with depression, and I think he self-medicated with alcohol. The problem with chemicals, and we'll talk about this more too, the problem with chemicals is that they work. Chemicals numb feelings, and a drug is a drug is a drug. Whether you drink it, whether you snort it, whether you inject it, whether you drop it in your eyes, a drug is a drug is a drug. And so for him, being a man working on the railroad in the 40s, there was no way that he could say, I'm really struggling with depression. Yeah. So he self-medicated with alcohol, which is what ended up killing him. So my 4 children, have depression and alcoholism on my grandpa's side. And then on my husband, their dad's side, his father died of alcoholism. He struggled with alcoholism and anxiety. So my kids won the jackpot. The trick is that we talk about it. I think that's really a gift. My brother many years ago talked about in our family, we have this thing called depression, and he talked about brain chemistry. He's a biochemist, and he talked about that. And so he kind of broke the no talk rule. So in our family, we talked about it. So we say, Uncle Tom has diabetes, so you have to be aware genetically of diabetes. We also talk about chemical dependency, and we talk about depression and anxiety. It's really a wonderful time to be alive with regards to all that we know about brain chemistry. And we will, and Chris in particular, will share some of that as we go on today. So we're going to talk about comorbidity, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But what happens when we have a stressor like alcoholism, which is comorbid, meaning it exists at the same time as a mental health concern like depression. So these are the questions that we're going to talk about today. I will give you a second to look these over. And we'll go ahead.
I'll just make one comment here, Cindy. First of all, thank you for sharing that about your family. I'm amazed that you and I are not related, because that story echoes, what we have in our family. And but I like the fact that you mentioned that you talk about it, and your kids, as my kids, are aware that they have this genetic vulnerability, and we talk often about it. So it's out in the open. There's really no stigma, and we know that to be. We're going to talk here toward the end about protective factors. How do we help protect young people from developing comorbid disorders? And one of the ways we do that is recognizing our family history and talking about that and being aware of it early on. So thank you. And I also wanted to mention too that we're coming at this topic not as necessarily substance use counselors. We are prevention specialists. Cindy, though, is a therapist, so she has a little different lens than I do. But when I talk about this topic, I'm talking about it from the perspective of recognizing, knowing what those risk and protective factors are, and using that knowledge to help determine how we're going to prevent or intervene early in a young person's life.
Thank you, Chris. So I like to start with this. This is the Chinese symbol for crisis. Now, I will tell you right off the bat, there's some question about, is this really the Chinese symbol for crisis? But for today, we'll say this is the Chinese symbol for crisis. It incorporates the two symbols of danger and opportunity. I think it's a great symbol when we talk about mental health and alcohol, tobacco, other drug abuse issues for kids, is there's danger there. Probably we all know children in our own lives or in our work who have struggled with mental health and alcohol, tobacco, and other drug abuse. We may have even lost loved ones. We also know that there's opportunity there, that if we can get our foot in the door in children's lives, we can help facilitate some incredible change. This I love. This is from an Iroquois prophet. We bind ourselves together by taking hold of each other's hands so firmly and forming a circle so strong that if a tree should fall upon it, it could not shake or break it. And that's exactly what you do in your work, and that's exactly what we're doing with this conference.
So we're going to get into this now. We're going to talk about comorbidity, and not that term necessarily is the central point of this presentation, but it kind of helps us. It helps kind of unite the two topics that we're going to be discussing. So comorbidity, and Cindy already defined it for us. It's when two disorders occur simultaneously in someone's life or sequentially in someone's life. And we also know that having a substance use disorder and a mental health disorder co-occurring also can worsen the symptoms of both in a person's life.
And as a therapist, I know that it's very seldom anymore that someone is diagnosed with alcohol or other drug abuse addiction without looking at some other mental health concerns.
Yeah. So here's the prevalence among adults being defined as age 18 and older. So you can see here numerically it's close to 8 million people. It could be 8 million people now, given what we're experiencing in our world today. But among adults that have a substance use disorder, Close to 38% also are living and struggling with a mental illness. And among adults with a mental illness, close to 20% are struggling with a substance use disorder. So it's prevalent, which is why we're talking about it today.
And Chris, I'm glad you brought up the situation in our world today with COVID, because of course, a stressor like that, that's a worldwide stressor, of course, that's going to increase the incidence of mental health and alcohol, tobacco, and other drug abuse. The problem with chemicals, remember, is that they work. Chemicals numb feelings. So if I wake up and I'm feeling scared and lonely and sad, I smoke a joint, or I take a drink, or I drop acid, or I inject. Remember, a drug is a drug is a drug, and I feel better. It works, and it works every time until it doesn't.
Here's another depiction of how the two interact. And this slide looks at how much more likely a person with a mental health disorder is to have a substance use disorder compared to people without a mental health disorder. And so you can see by the data on this slide that people living with a mental health disorder are at much greater risk and are much more likely to seek out substances as a way to self-medicate, like Cindy indicated.
And here's what I miss about doing this in person. Can you go back to that slide for a second, Chris?
Sure. Yep.
I love the fact that I'm sitting in my living room in my slippers. I do. But I really miss doing this in person, because this is a point where I would say to the audience, raise your hand if you have someone that you care about in your life who struggles with mental health concerns, who struggles with addiction. Yeah, that's right. And so to be able to kind of share that in a group of people, again, as Chris said, it decreases stigma, it normalizes it. So feel free in your own, the privacy of your own living room, to raise your hand if you want.
Cindy, is this you?
This would be me, yeah. Okay, so why do mental illnesses and substance use disorders co-occur? Co-occurring means they happen at the same time. It could be that people with mental health concerns self-medicate. Remember, the problem with chemicals is that they work. So I feel anxious, I feel depressed, and again, I take a drink, I smoke a joint, whatever the case may be, and it alleviates those symptoms. The problem with chemicals is that they work until they don't. And so, for instance, for my grandfather, I think his alcohol use worked to manage his depression until he ended up dying from his alcohol use. Causal effects, substance abuse may increase the vulnerability, and we're learning more and more about that. We'll talk about this a little later, but here's one that just hit me between the eyes. What we know is that research has shown in the past a correlation between early marijuana use and early onset schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
It showed a correlation. What research is now showing is a causation. Not always, but early marijuana use, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, they're showing causation between early marijuana use and early onset schizophrenia. And this causal effect, it may increase the vulnerability. That's what they're talking about there. Common or correlated facts, causes, risk factors. What we know is that, and there's another slide coming up that deals with this, but it could be that mental health concerns cause people to use chemicals. It could be that chemical use causes people to have mental health concerns. Or it could be that those are both branches of the same tree. And that's what we're finding more and more, is both share common genes and involve common brain circuits.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And so why adolescents? Why are we focused on young people? And we know, and we're learning more and more about this, that adolescence and early childhood too, let's not discount that, is a very vulnerable period for the onset of these disorders. So that's why we want to look more closely at this. Here we know that, 1 in 4 young people that are using an addictive substance, which includes nicotine, develop addiction by the time they're adults. When you look at it the other way, about 9 and 10 or 90% of people struggling with a substance use problem currently began using prior to the age of 18. So that again speaks to the importance of this developmental stage in adolescence.
And you've probably heard it said that alcohol, marijuana, and nicotine are gateway drugs. They open the door to open the gates to use of harder drugs. I worked with an AODA therapist many years ago who was very wise. He said, early use of alcohol, tobacco, marijuana open the gates to people with harder drugs. So if I'm smoking weed down in the ravine, I'm hanging out with, if I'm 14 smoking weed in the ravine, I'm hanging out with 21-year-olds who have access to harder drugs. So it opens the door to people with harder drugs. Here's another thing I want to jump in and say is that the good news comes at the end of this presentation. A lot of this is not so great news. The good news comes at the end. But here's the other thing, raise your hand if you've ever dealt with some hard stuff in your life, right? If you've ever dealt with some hard stuff. Hard stuff is not all bad, because hard stuff is some of what makes us stronger. We'll talk about that more in a little bit.
So the other sort of piece to what Cindy was sharing about the use of these common drugs like nicotine, marijuana, and alcohol, exposing people or introducing people to harder drugs. The other thing too that we have to remember is that we learn from experiences. So we learn, as Cindy pointed out a few times now, that drugs work until they don't. And when we learn that, and if we are very sensitive to the rewarding effects of those drugs, we naturally begin to seek out similar experiences and look for other drugs that maybe could provide even more pleasure or comfort. So that's, I think, an important way to look at this whole issue around substances, is that what we're talking about here is learned behavior, and it may be dysfunctional information that we're learning, but we oftentimes will head down the path of substance use because of our experience, what we've learned about it.
And as you look at this slide, I think this is so interesting. If you look at where all of those overlap, especially the bottom 4, it's right between ages about 14 and 20. That's exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Chris gets the credit for putting this PowerPoint together, by the way. He's the tech guy. He's the whiz.
None of these slides are unique to me. I have borrowed them. So, and I learned early on in my master's work in education that as long as you're using it to teach and educate, it's all there. You can use whatever you want. So I don't know if that's accurate, but it's worked for me. So, but I think here's the other important fact, and that is, again, like Cindy pointed out, we know that half of all mental health disorders show up before a person turns 14, right? And 75% or 3/4 begin before age 24. So there's that window. And if you think of what we know about adolescent brain development, we know that this is a critical window in adolescent brain development. So it makes sense that if genetically I'm predisposed to a mental illness or substance use disorder, or if I live in an environment that is toxic for me, this is the time when I'm going to be most vulnerable to developing these disorders.
And as Chris mentioned before, biology plays a significant part in this, but biology is not always destiny.
right.
The saving grace for me in all this is that our children have you. They have you, and that's what keeps their heads above water sometimes.
So again, thinking about this from a prevention standpoint, and I really think this slide kind of goes back to the symbol that Cindy shared with us about crisis and opportunity, danger and opportunity. So we know that the early onset of a mental health problem and or the early onset of substance use can pose a danger, but it's also an opportunity. The earlier we can intervene, the earlier we can implement evidence-based prevention programs, the earlier we can use things like SBIRT to help identify kids that might be struggling, the better their outcomes are going to be. Because beginning treatment or applying prevention in this window of brain development that where the brain is so sensitive and is actually shaped by experiences, that tells us that if we can be effective at during that age, the kids, young people are going to benefit.
Yeah. And raise your hand if you have people in your life you care about who struggled with mental health and alcohol, tobacco, and other drug abuse concerns as children and adolescents, and now are doing okay in their lives. You know, again, adversity makes us stronger. So the goal is, as the Iroquois prophet quote, is that we put our arms around our children in such a way that if a tree should fall upon it, it could not shake or break it.
So part of what we know is happening, and we're not going to do a deep dive certainly into brain development. If I were capable of doing that, I would be making a lot more money, but I'm not. But I think it's important to understand that this is what's occurring during adolescence, that the brain is going through a period of use it or lose it. Parts of brain circuits that aren't being used repetitively begin to die off and go away, right? So if a young person learns early on that that I can feel a whole lot better if I use a drug, okay, and I continue to repeat that behavior, that is slowly becoming hardwired into my brain during this period, which is why this is so critical. Think about when in our lifespan we are most effective in terms of learning new knowledge. Well, it's during school, during elementary, middle, and high school, right? I mean, that's when we are peak learners, because our brains at that age are programmed to absorb information and to hardwire it and program it. And so the brain doesn't know the difference between a drug and a math formula, okay? The brain does help us recognize what really feels good. And if it really feels good, I'm probably going to repeat that behavior, okay? Which is, again, why it's so important that we intervene in lives of young people early with some of this.
And as Chris mentioned, that the prime age for learning is those school years. I'm 61, so I'm also hoping that like 61 to 100 is part of that too.
You know what? That's good. Me too. And I learned that one of the best things I learned is that, and I'm referring to myself here, old dogs do learn new tricks thanks to this thing called neurogenesis. So even at our age, we're still developing new brain cells in order to learn things. However, we're never going to learn something as quickly and as effectively as we did when we were adolescents, as long as we weren't using it at that time. So what are the risk factors? And again, this is really the heart of why we're talking about this, because if we understand what risk and protective factors influence comorbid disorders, the development of comorbid disorders, then we're going to be more effective in preventing and intervening and treating. Here you go, Cindy.
Okay, increasing the risk of developing comorbid mental health and substance use. So we know that there's substance use disorders and mental health disorders, and that overlap. Again, as I say, as a therapist, I seldom see people who are diagnosed with addiction issues who don't have mental health concerns. So there are shared risk factors, but there are also shared protective factors.
You didn't say, I thought you were going to go back to branches of the same tree.
And you know, they're branches of the same tree.
I like that. I love, you came up with that, and I think it's a great way to visualize this.
Yeah, and there's also research, gene research being done about a lot of the risk factors for addiction and for mental health concerns. They're finding that some of those are located on the same gene. So again, it's a great time to be alive in terms of science and brain chemistry around this stuff.
So again, you know, this slide demonstrates again the role that genes play, and we can't discount that. Some of us are loaded with risk, and Cindy shared the story of her family. Our family is very similar. Okay, so we know that with mental health disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar, ADHD, depression, the genes contribute a great deal to the risk of developing those disorders. Now, but like Cindy said, and I think it's really important to remember this, that we are not our genes necessarily. Genes are not our fate, because again, genes need to be turned on oftentimes for these things to develop. So what turns those genes on are our experiences, our environment, our biology, and that's what provides that window for us to prevent and intervene.
And when I talk to my kids in particular about mental health, because of their background with alcoholism, their family background, alcoholism, depression, anxiety, I talk about it being a three-legged stool, that there is, you know, sleep, nutrition, exercise. That's one leg. That's a really important leg. There's also the possibility of counseling, which is another important leg. Also the possibility of medication when it's appropriate. So there's a number of ways to address this. And I think starting with exercise, sleep, nutrition is a really important place to start.
So the same is true in terms of developing a substance use disorder. The research is all over the map here. I just read an article the other day kind of putting the risk, the genetic vulnerability at 40 to 60%. But we get the point here that genes, that family history, those genes that Cindy's grandpa passed through down to her and she passed to her kids, those are powerful, meaning, and again, meaning if we don't talk about it, you know, if Cindy wasn't talking to her kids about it and explaining the risk, then her kids would be at much higher risk of developing these disorders based on choices that they made. So that's a critical piece here.
I think the other piece, first of all, I want to say, if you look at this, genetics account for 50 to 75%. That means that 25 to 50% genetics don't account for it. So I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, and that whole idea,
about the second thing I was going to say.
that it'll come to you. That whole thing, that whole notion that genes need to be turned on, right? And if we can prevent those genes from being turned on, or once they are turned on, if we can work with those young people to maybe turn on other genes, we can have we can have an impact.
So take a look at this slide if you would. We're starting now to talk about ACEs, which you're probably familiar with, adverse childhood experiences. There's been fabulous research done through Kaiser Permanente on ACEs. But if you look at abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, so I'm a foster parent. My husband and I are foster parents, and this is why children go into foster care, is because of those situations. But again, it's not entirely destiny. That what we do as foster parents and what you do every single day as school staff is you help to mitigate. You help to mitigate these concerns, and you help to add protective factors, which we'll talk about in a bit.
And again, I just want to point just briefly to that top to the title, and this is Wisconsin data. So 1 in 5 of our children between the ages of birth and 17 have experienced 2 or more of the following. Okay, so like Cindy said, it doesn't mean that these experiences are going to manifest themselves in health disorders and mental health disorders, but being aware of that and understanding that many of the kids that are in front of me or that I work with every day have these experiences could help, or should help influence how I'm interacting with them. And like Cindy said, understanding how powerful our role is in mitigating the impact of those. And so people that successfully, people that are survivors and thrivers as adults will almost always, if not always, point to adults that played a key role in helping them and in buffering against those. And we'll talk more about that in our prevention section.
And very often those adults were school people.
Yes. And here is a sort of a visual summary of how these experiences can impact a young person. And really, what we know is that young people that live in a state of toxic stress, where stress is a part of their everyday lives, and they are put in a position where they are constantly in survival mode, constantly seeking to protect themselves, to put themselves out of harm's way. Those kids, without any protective factors or any interventions, those kids develop a part of the brain that is focused on survival, fight, flight, or flee, or whatever that is.
Flight, fight, or freeze.
Yeah, freeze. I knew it rhymed with that.
Actually, there's a fourth one: fight, flight, freeze, or flock. And flock is coming together. That's a kind of a more healthy way to address it.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
So what happens with these kids is their amygdala, which is part of that survival circuit in the brain, gets very strong. But it gets very strong at the expense of the learning part of the brain or the executive function part of the brain, because all of the resources are going to survival. And so oftentimes what happens, and we know that and Cindy mentioned this, one of the significant issues, drivers or triggers, those things that turn those switches on, is stress, right? And when a young person is experiencing adverse childhood experiences and experiencing toxic stress, they grow up to be adults that have a really hard time managing stress. And what happens when we can't manage stress? We self-medicate, right? So this is so critical.
Especially in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, folks. And
Yep.
so what Chris mentioned about the parts of the brain, this is fascinating to me. The part of the brain called the hippocampus is responsible for learning. The part of the brain called the amygdala is responsible for feeling. So when the amygdala is working, when the amygdala feels safe, the hippocampus can work and the person can learn. If the amygdala is in a place where it's not feeling safe, I don't care how many tests we give kids, that hippocampus is not going to work and they're not going to learn. One of my many Mother of the Year experiences many years ago, I was yelling at my son for something. I don't remember what it was. He was a little kid, and I was yelling at him, and he looked up at me and he said, "Mom, I can't hear you when you yell at me. I can't hear you when you yell at me." Because when the amygdala doesn't feel safe, the hippocampus can't work.
That's a great example. So how prevalent and how impactful are ACEs? Many of you have probably seen this image before, but essentially the way I look at it is if we eliminated adverse childhood experiences, we could reduce the rates of anxiety by almost 60%. We could reduce the general feelings of hopelessness by over 40%. Heavy alcohol use by 20, so this speaks to the impact that ACEs are having. And again, remember that when we're talking about ACEs, while adults do obviously experience trauma, that trauma has an impact on our health and well-being. When we're talking about ACEs, we're talking about those adverse childhood experiences. So these are experiences that are occurring during those very formidable years and that are altering really the way the brain is programmed to cope with stress.
And again, we'll talk about protective factors in a little bit, but protective factors like school staff can help mitigate the impact of that.
Yes, absolutely. And even like Cindy said, even in this current time of a pandemic, where I constantly am hearing stories about the great ways that teachers and school staff are working extremely hard to stay connected to young people, to let young people know that they care about them and that they're important, even if that young person can't be within the building. So the neat thing is that we may be preaching to the choir in this presentation, but that's okay. The choir needs some preaching as well.
So I have a great story I just thought about. I have a neighbor and friend who's a teacher, a high school teacher, and we were just talking the other day across the fence, and he said that he had a student that he hasn't come on for Google Meets for quite a while, and he happened to have that kid's phone number, and so he texted the boy and said, I haven't seen you, I miss you, I hope you're doing okay. The kid texted him back immediately. And then the teacher called him. He called him on the phone and they had this great conversation. And the kid said, you must think I'm a bad student. I'm not a bad student. I just am having a really hard time learning this way. And so that gave that kid a safe place to say, this is really hard. And it gave the teacher a place to make a connection. Because we know of all the protective factors, the relationship with a significant adult is one of the most important. And that's what he was doing. He was making a connection with that kid.
So let's read the question first. Again, how does substance use impact mental health? Well, Cindy summarized it for us at the outset. Oh, sorry. Hitting the wrong button. Right here. So a drug is a drug is a drug, and they work until they don't. So you can see examples of how different substances affect emotions and relieve different stressors that are influencing emotions. Okay.
Let's stay on this slide for a second, Chris, because I think it's important to look at, in a time where there are initiatives to legalize cannabis, across the nation and really across the world. If you look at cannabis on the bottom, which we know is marijuana or weed, cannabis is both stimulating and sedating depending on the symptoms. So, there's a long conversation, and Chris, you've been really involved in this statewide as a prevention person, a long conversation about legalizing marijuana. So here's the question: should people be spending 20 years in jail because of marijuana use? Probably not. Again, we want to look at the earlier a person starts using, the more likely they are to become addicted. So like alcohol, marijuana will never be legal for kids because that prefrontal cortex of the brain that helps us make good decisions, that part of the brain is not fully developed until around 18 to 24. And so the impact of drugs on that developing prefrontal cortex is really powerful. So the piece about, as Chris mentioned, you want to put off first use as late as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So now let's look at the flip side, and we're going to spend more time here because it's a little bit more involved, a little bit more complicated. So let's talk about early onset chemical use.
So we're looking at the progression of the disease, and I see we've got about 30 minutes left. So we want to have an awareness of that. Progression of the disease, just take a minute to look at this. This is called the Jellinek curve. This has been around for a long time. Basically, it's the descent into chemical abuse and dependency. Remember, a drug is a drug is a drug. And then on the right side, into recovery. And probably most of us have people in our lives that we care about who struggled with chemical abuse. And probably we have people we care about in our lives who are in recovery. So this tends to be the flow of that. These are some warning signs. I'm going to give you a second to look at that. Warning signs in kids in particular. I had a story in one of my trainings of a tech ed, industrial arts tech ed person who was in one of my trainings, and he told the story of one of his kids was making an incense burner in industrial arts or in tech ed. And, when you don't know, you don't know. And this teacher didn't know that it wasn't really an incense burner, it was a pot pipe. And so kids can be, they can not always tell the truth. And sometimes they're incredibly creative about the ways that they do that.
The other thing I like about this slide is that it reminds us too, some of these things, some of these warning signs remind us of typical adolescence.
Yes.
Not all, but some do, right? And so we oftentimes will find ourselves, those of you that have parented adolescents, we wonder to ourselves, is this just him or her being a teenager, or should I pay attention to this and find out what's driving this behavior? And I would say that even if it resembles typical adolescence and you're concerned about it, I would check in and I would find out what's driving some of this.
One of the things when Chris and I train, when we do QPR or youth mental health first aid, we always say never worry alone. Don't worry alone. If you're worried about somebody that you care about, don't lay there in bed at 2 a.m. and perseverate. Talk to people about it. Don't worry alone. And so, as Chris mentioned, a lot of this looks like normal adolescence, change in friends, change in eating habits, change in dress, change in attitude. Looks a lot like normal adolescence, but in combination could be a red flag. So that's where it's important to not only check in with the child, as Chris mentioned, but also to check in with their teacher, their piano teacher, their Boy Scout leader, to kind of put 2 and 2 together. Because when kids are using chemicals, they tend to keep people apart. So I want to keep my math teacher separate from my mom, separate from my youth leader, because if they start to talk to each other, the light will go on. So we want to make sure that we don't worry alone, that we talk to people.
Absolutely.
So if the thing about this, gonna take a minute to look at this. And Chris, I think I'm going to give this one to you because you're really good at this.
Well, and I think, you know, there, like Cindy mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of debate about the term gateway. And in fact, the scientist that coined that term almost regrets not following up and providing more information on what she meant by that term. But what we do know and what the facts clearly point to is that early nicotine use is a strong predictor for early onset substance use problems and early onset mental illness, or vice versa. Early nicotine use could be self-medicating untreated mental health symptoms. So we know that young people with ADHD that goes untreated are at much higher risk of becoming dependent on nicotine, dependent on cannabis, because those chemicals calm their brains a little bit. They work a little bit.
And it shouldn't. My grandma used to say when she smoked, she would say, it calms me down. Well, it shouldn't, because nicotine's a stimulant, but that is exactly how it works.
Right. And when you think about medications, prescribed medications for ADD and ADHD, those medications are stimulants, which, you know, is counterintuitive, but essentially those chemicals in those prescription drugs speed up those parts of the brain that are working too slow to pay attention and to focus. So it's kind of weird how that works. So those drugs early on help a little bit, but there are other behavioral effects. There's other cognitive effects that come with those drugs that are really counterproductive in a young person's life.
So nicotine, we need to be aware of nicotine. And again, we talked about the earlier a person starts using, the more likely they are to become dependent. And I think that this slide shows that perfectly. You look at drinking at a younger age raises the risk of dependence regardless of family history. So our goal, part of our goal in prevention is to push off first use of a drug. The older, the better.
And this is I like the slide because it's kind of colorful, but this is a visual summary of the research. This comes from a meta-analysis that was published this year on the long-term effects of underage drinking on adult brain function and behavior. And essentially what they're learning and what they've learned is that early in regular alcohol use alters the structure and function of brain cells in different regions of the brain, okay? And that impact has that long-term modification of these structures and functions is what leads to increased rates of mental health disorders as adults, right, as well as dependence. And that's what's captured in the box underneath the brain diagram: increased anxiety, depression, risky decision-making, memory deficiency, subsequent use of other drugs, and then alcohol dependence, right? So that's again, another reason why we want to resist the temptation of saying, well, you know, they're teenagers, they're going to do what they're going to do. Well, they are, and that's why they need us to say, you know what, we don't want you to do that, and this is why, you know, and help them understand. The same is true for early cannabis use, right? The earlier someone starts to use cannabis, the greater the risk for developing a cannabis use disorder. And, a lot of, there used to be this myth, and I think it's going away. People are understanding it, and research is helping us understand it. But the myth was, that cannabis or marijuana was not addictive. Well, there have been a number of studies and replicate over time that show that cannabis, what are some of the primary warning signs or signs of dependence? Well, it's increased tolerance, right? And then experiencing physical and psychological withdrawal symptoms. And the research has found that both of those occur in cannabis use disorder. And they are more severe, again, the younger a young person begins to use on a regular basis. And that's what's captured in that red box.
Here we look at THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the active ingredient, the main psychoactive ingredient in marijuana or cannabis. And I want you to look at the increase in THC over time. And this is only till 2014. I'll tell you it's gone up significantly in the last 6 years. So this is not your parents' marijuana. The THC component has increased significantly. At the bottom, and we're not going to take a whole lot of time to talk about this, but CBD is kind of the calming ingredient that we're finding in marijuana. And when we're able to separate out the CBDs from the THC, there are definitely some beneficial uses of CBD.
This was another meta-analysis of a number of different studies. And what this speaks to is the age of onset and the frequency of use and the impact on or the risk for developing a substance use disorder related to other drugs. So again, this is not necessarily the trying to prove or disprove the gateway effect, but given those points that Cindy talked about earlier on, whether it be the social exposure to other drugs or the desire to seek other highs, the earlier and more frequently a young person uses cannabis, the more likely they will be to move on to other substances. And again, you look at the age ranges along the bottom of this graph. Like Cindy said, this is why we want to push out that first use or any use. The longer a young person can wait, their risk of developing problems goes down significantly. We're going to talk a little bit about endocannabinoids. And like I told Cindy as we were prepping for this, I know enough about this to trip over it a lot, but I think it's critically important to understand it. Endocannabinoids are naturally occurring chemicals in the brain. Our brain has them. They're neurotransmitters. Okay, they're in all regions of the brain. Okay, you can see here with the yellow specks. This is where endocannabinoids function throughout the brain, and they have a specific role, and their role is to regulate brain activity, okay, in all of these regions, and they work kind of like, I've heard it described in other ways, but the way that resonates with me is like a dimmer switch. So if a part of the brain is overactive, the endocannabinoid helps turn that down a little bit, which can explain to some degree why cannabis use can have initially a calming effect, right? But these endocannabinoids are critical. They play a critical role in brain development because of this, right? So here you could see the three bigs, the big points on this. One is they guide neurons to grow to the right places in the brain, right? They control neuron activity, which affects pruning. Remember, we talked about the pruning and then the hardwiring, which is the myelination, and endocannabinoids support that. So in essence, endocannabinoids play a critical role in brain development, okay? What happens though is that THC is chemically very similar to endocannabinoids. So when THC enters the brain, it can also dock on the same neurons that endocannabinoids function on. Except for me, THC is like an endocannabinoid on steroids. Okay, so because they're able to function in the same places as endocannabinoids, they do so in extremes, okay? So THC is much stronger, has a longer effect on brain cells, and it interferes with our brain system of protecting neurons and keeping brain activity in balance. So think about that. Think about the role then that THC has on influencing the rate and location of the pruning and myelination that needs to happen during adolescent development. So that's, again, what we're learning about cannabis, and I think what we're trying to emphasize here is that we need to really start talking to young people about cannabis and its impact. And like Cindy said, I'm not sure that legalization or current prohibition is really going to have an impact as much as having caring adults spend time talking to kids about what cannabis does.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So let's kind of breeze through these next couple ones. We'll take the last 15 minutes to look at, and I think you went backwards there, Chris.
I think we have till 2:30, but we're going to go until they turn us off.
All right.
So this comes from the same report, but this one focuses on cannabinoids and the impact that adolescent cannabis use has on long-term adult brain functioning. And you can see that the same cannabis impacts the brain in the same way. It impacts the structure and function of brain cells and brain function. And in those areas where it has that impact, it increases the risk for adult depression, anxiety, and like Cindy said, psychosis, and certainly learning, memory, and risk of other drug use. Okay, so it's young people that begin to use cannabis on a regular basis throughout adolescence and into early adulthood fundamentally change the structure of their brain. And it's the same with alcohol.
So regular marijuana use, as Chris mentioned, increases the risk of, especially early marijuana use, psychosis, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression. The research is very clear on that.
You know, I volunteer because of my own lived experience and family experience with a support group for adults who have adult loved ones that are living with mental illness. And almost, not all, but almost all of the adults with an adult loved one that's living with schizophrenia talks about early marijuana use in that person's life. Okay, so this is huge. Now the good news. This is where Cindy has wanted to get us, and now we're here.
We're going to talk about protective factors. The research time and time again, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but Dr. Emmy Werner did some research on resiliency on the island of Kauai in Hawaii. You'll want to Google it. Basically, what she found was that the presence of a significant supportive adult was the most important thing in helping people do well in their lives, especially people who come from families where there are a high ACEs, where there's lots of ACEs. So look on the right side, schools, positive youth development, parents, conversations, providers. We're all part of this. We're all holding our hands around these kids so that if a tree should fall upon it, it could not shake or break it.
And we know that one of the most protective factors against substance use is when that caring adult engages the young person in conversation about substance use. Respectful, non-judgmental, informative conversation is a strong protective factor. And really, I think a lot of you might be aware of the state campaign now on underage drinking titled Small Talks. And so there's, if you Google Small Talks Wisconsin, you'll come to the state's website with a plethora of resources and tips and tools to help caring adults and parents begin to have those conversations with young people about these topics.
So that one on the right, I want to highlight.
Yep.
If you look at Teachers Can Help Reduce Marijuana Use from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, if your students have taken the YRBS, those last 4 questions I think are really important. Having a teacher who encourage them and support them. When you lay that over chemical use, those kids have a lower use of chemical use because they have school staff who support them. Sources of strength. This is probably not an unfamiliar picture to many of you. What we've learned is that Sources of Strength is a research-based, evidence-based program. It has been shown to reduce suicidal ideation and completed suicides, particularly in large schools. What we know is that it's a strength-based program, and if you look at all those pieces of the pie, and you can read those are all pieces of the pie that come together to help create supports for our children.
And again, using the language that we've been using, these are protective factors. And the more of these protective factors a young person has access to, the better their outcomes. And we know that one of our priorities, and I know the priorities of the WISH Center and with DPI, is that whole focus on mental health and nurturing, fostering positive mental health. So if you're a school district that's doing Sources of Strength, man, I applaud you. I think it's wonderful. If you're from a school district that hasn't gotten there yet, really encourage your administration to urge them to adopt this program. And it's, like Cindy said, it's not an educational program. This is changing the culture within the school so that everybody feels connected.
And I would do a shout out to the Appleton School District, because Appleton is really looking, and really all the districts, we all are looking at mental health supports for our children and mental health supports for our staff. This is a tricky time for staff. And so to create supports for our students and for our staff, this is a really important time for that. Social
emotional learning. I don't think anybody this is probably new to everybody. This is a priority, and I really applaud DPI, the WISH Center, for really diving into this and investing in this in a big way, in supporting schools and school staff. This is how we build resilience. This is how we buffer risk factors. We buffer the impact of ACEs. This is how we set young people up for succeeding. And not only does this work promote resilience, but we also, the research is pretty clear that kids with with strong social emotional competencies do better academically as well. So there's a direct tie to what school districts really care about, and that's academic success. And they're closely tied to one another. So again, I would doubt that your school district hasn't adopted some level of this. And then again, I applaud you. And the beauty of this is there's going to be some wonderful resources available to schools from the Wish Center to help them infuse this completely into their school communities. And then the last one is resiliency. I have been in the work long enough the very first training I ever went to over 20 years ago was I spent a week with Nan Henderson. I don't know if people know who Nan Henderson is, but she has translated a lot of the work that Cindy talks about with the research from Emmy Werner and Ann Maston and other research. She translated that into a practical approach for how do we build resiliency in young people. And again, if you look at this wheel, it's about putting that each young person in the middle of this circle, right? And surrounding them with these protective factors. So I encourage you, if you're interested in this, I put Dr. Henderson's website address on the bottom. It's pretty straightforward, www.resiliency.com. And there's a lot more information there. Here you go. We're wrapping up.
So we're going to wrap up. I love this quote. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And finally, this is called kintsugi, and I have a kintsugi bowl right here that I'm going to show you, and I want to read this part. It says, more beautiful for being broken. The story of kintsugi may have begun in the 15th century when a shogun warrior sent a damaged Chinese bowl back to China to be fixed. He challenged the Japanese craftsmen to find a new form of repair that could make a broken piece look as good as new or better. They mended the bowl with gold. To his delight, the bowl looked better for having been broken. When we view our lives as sometimes broken or even shattered, we begin to understand that no matter the trauma, fear, failure, addiction, disease, or even death, our scars are just a part of us. We must look at these breaks as a place for beauty to transpire. Each time we will see we are more beautiful for being broken. So thank you for your time and attention. We are most grateful, and somewhere out there in the world, our emails will be that you are welcome to contact us with questions or comments.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time and really appreciate the work you're doing with young people in your communities. Thank you.